Question 1. Listen to the recording and complete the notes below. Write no more than 3 words or number for each answer.
As we saw in the last lecture, a major cause of climate change is the rapid rise in the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last century. If we could reduce the amount of CO2, perhaps the rate of climate change could also be slowed down. One potential method involves enhancing the role of the soil that plants grow in with regard to absorbing CO2. Ratan Lal, a soil scientist from Ohio State University in the USA, claims that the world's agricultural soils could potentially absorb 13% of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the equivalent of the amount released in the last 30 years, and research is going on into how this might be achieved. Lal first came to the idea that soil might be valuable in this way, not through an interest in climate change, but rather out of concern for the land itself and the people dependent on it. Carbon-rich soil is dark, crumbly and fertile, and retains some water. But erosion can occur if soil is dry, which is a likely effect if it contains inadequate amounts of carbon. Erosion is of course bad for people trying to grow crops or breed animals on that terrain. In the 1970s and 80s, Lal was studying soils in Africa so devoid of organic matter that the ground had become extremely hard, like cement. There he met a pioneer in the study of global warming, who suggested that carbon from the soil had moved into the atmosphere. This is now looking increasingly likely. Let me explain. For millions of years, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have been regulated, in part, by a natural partnership between plants and microbes, tiny organisms in the soil. Plants absorb CO2 from the air and transform it into sugars and other carbon-based substances. While a proportion of these carbon products remain in the plant, some transfer from the roots to fungi and soil microbes, which store the carbon in the soil. The invention of agriculture some 10,000 years ago disrupted these ancient soil-building processes and led to the loss of carbon from the soil. When humans started draining the natural topsoil and ploughing it up for planting, they exposed the buried carbon to oxygen. This created carbon dioxide and released it into the air. And in some places, grazing by domesticated animals has removed all vegetation, releasing carbon into the air. Tons of carbon have been stripped from the world's soils, where it's needed, and pumped into the atmosphere. So, what can be done? Researchers are now coming up with evidence that even modest changes to farming can significantly help to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Some growers have already started using an approach known as regenerative agriculture. This aims to boost the fertility of soil and keep it moist through established practices. These include keeping fields planted all year round and increasing the variety of plants being grown. Strategies like these can significantly increase the amount of carbon stored in the soil, so agricultural researchers are now building a case for their use in combating climate change. One American investigation into the potential for storing CO2 on agricultural lands is taking place in California. Soil scientist Wendy Silver of the University of California, Berkeley, is conducting a first-of-its-kind study on a large cattle farm in the state. She and her students are testing the effects on carbon storage of the compost that is created from waste, both agricultural, including manure and corn stalks, and waste produced in gardens, such as leaves, branches and lawn trimmings. In Australia, soil ecologist Christine Jones is testing another promising soil enrichment strategy. Jones and 12 farmers are working to build up soil carbon by cultivating grasses, that stay green all year round. Like composting, the approach has already been proved experimentally. Jones now hopes to show that it can be applied on working farms and that the resulting carbon capture can be accurately measured. It's hoped in the future that projects such as these will demonstrate the role that farmers and other land managers can play in reducing the harmful effects of greenhouse gases. For example, in countries like the United States, where most farming operations use large applications of fertilizer, changing such long-standing habits will require a change of system. Ratan Lal argues that farmers should receive payment, not just for the corn or beef they produce, but also for the carbon they can store in their soil. Another study being carried out...
Question 2. You will hear a radio report about British people buying holiday homes abroad. Listen and answer the questions with no more than 3 words or number.
Attracted by the prospect of their own place in the sun and an easy way of making money, the number of British people owning a second home abroad is booming as never before. Around 800,000 British households now own a second home abroad, up by 15% since June 2004, according to research published this week. The boom has been fueled by television programs about people buying abroad and assisted by the rise in property values in Britain, low interest rates and the availability of cheap no-thrill flights. A better climate remains the main reason, with more than half of the nearly 2,000 people questioned giving that as their principal reason for buying overseas. However, an increasing number are seeking to invest in new builds, with 40% of respondents saying that making money was their prime motivation, while 38% wanted a future retirement property and somewhere to take their family. A senior financial analyst said that the property boom has increased levels of housing equity, while the low interest rate environment has allowed other prospective property purchasers to take advantage of relatively cheap borrowing. Overall, Spain remains the most popular destination for living abroad, with 43% naming it as their preferred location. Next is France, followed by Australia and Italy. Despite the increased interest in Eastern European countries, they still remain a target for a minority, with only 7% choosing such destinations. People like Bulgaria because it is a short flight from London, enjoys a Mediterranean-style climate in summer, as well as skiing in the winter. It has safe swimming in the Black Sea and boasts the cheapest property prices in Europe. Additionally, it is about to join the EU and low-cost airlines are expected to expand their routes there. However, many of the latest wave of buyers plunged in without considering the consequences after watching television programs. Generally, it tends to work better if you want a holiday home rather than an investment, because a lot of people don't realise that tax and inheritance laws are different abroad. Plus, ownership rights can also be problematic.
Question 3. Listen to the recording and decide whether the information in each sentence is true, T, or false, F, or not given, NG.
We have in the studio today Vernon Hall, an expert on theatre history, to tell us all about Helen Perry, one of the greatest actresses of all time.
Helen Perry was born in 1847, right in the middle of the 19th century, when the theatre was the main form of public entertainment. Her acting career didn't actually get off to a very promising start, which was not surprising given that acting was considered an unsuitable career for a young woman. So she waited until she was 22 before going on stage to avoid her parents' disapproval. Once on the stage, she found that she had other problems. Although her first part was very small, she had great trouble learning the lines, and according to her, this was something she found difficult throughout her acting career. However, this did not prevent her from becoming an incredibly successful actress. People who saw her act said that the thing that made her so special was her voice. Apparently, it had an almost hypnotic quality. However, it nearly brought her career to an abrupt end when she was in her 50s. Her voice just got lower and huskier, and she quite often lost it when she had a cold. Finally, she had a very risky throat operation, which paid off because she went on acting for another 25 years after that. Helen Perry is now remembered as a great classical actress, but she was actually very skillful. She was, for example, a great comedy actress, which was what really gave her broad popular appeal. And she was immensely popular. At the height of her fame, people could buy all sorts of mementos like postcards and paperweights with her picture on. She was one of the first stars to have a perfume named in her honour. And that brand, simply called Helen, remained on sale until quite recently. It's always been known that several famous plays were written for her. But what isn't so well known is that she had literary talent herself, because we have the letters she exchanged with one writer, and they show she had great style and wit. Some people feel that she should have retired earlier when she was at her peak, but personally, I disagree. We have no film of her acting, of course, but from the reviews of her performances towards the end of her career, we can see that although she had difficulty walking, she is still described as magnetic. She picked up quite a few honorary degrees from various universities, something which had never happened to an actress before. She was pleased to get academic recognition, of course, but what really pleased her was the way that the audiences loved her, and that was all the recognition she really needed. She'll certainly never be forgotten.
Question 4. You will hear part of an interview with two chefs, Jane and Chris, who both won prizes in the National Railway Chef of the Year competition. Choose the best answer, A, B, C or D, which fits best according to what you hear.
Serving more than 200,000 meals a year would be a challenge for any chef. But step up constraints of time, space, and a demand for culinary excellence, and you have the life of a railway chef. Chris and Jane, the idea of having to cook in cramped surroundings with limited ingredients and a very tight schedule, as you did in the recent competition, must have been a terrifying prospect.
Well, hardly. I actually operate under those restrictions every day.
That's true, of course we both do. But there's always the added danger that things can go wrong. And the challenge of preparing a top-quality 3-course meal for 4, which costs no more than £50, and in front of all those judges.
Well, Jane, you were a runner-up and Chris came first. I gather you faced some stiff competition from the other finalists.
No doubt about that. All the chefs who entered the competition were brilliant in their own way, but someone has to win. But the real problem is trying to be creative as the train hurtles through the countryside at over 100 miles an hour. There's little room for mistakes, and you have to be able to keep your balance.
Actually, I'd only been a railway chef for 3 months, and I can tell you that life on board is no easy ride. There's no nipping out to get the extra bunch of parsley or a lemon.
But you're used to working under pressure all the same, aren't you? How do you set about being organised?
You've just got to make sure you're focused on the job. Being able to keep an eye on a dozen things at once is also an advantage.
But do you actually enjoy what you're doing?
Well, there's plenty of scope to express yourself as a chef in the job, and the open kitchen means that customers will often compliment you personally on the food. That's one of the biggest highlights of the job.
I'd certainly go along with that. Very few restaurant chefs have the chance to experience that.
And what about the menus? Who decides what to cook?
They're decided in advance for the whole railway network by 2 extremely famous chefs who are actually brothers. I suppose we both find it restricting.
I do get a bit frustrated from time to time, think I could be a little more adventurous. But it's all a question of adaptability, which I suspect Jane is better at than I am.
Not at all. I can be quite inflexible when the mood takes me.
So, what would be a typical routine for you both?
You have to start at around 5:30 in the morning. check that all the ingredients have been delivered. Then it's a mad rush to get everything ready.
And precious little time to rest any other time during the day, as you often have to set tables on other trains and help other staff. Timing's particularly tight, you see. In other restaurants, orders come in and go out over 2 or 3 hours, but we have to turn round before the passengers reach their stations. It's all a bit nerve-wracking.
So what motivated you to do this in the first place?
I've been on the move ever since I left college, so when I got engaged, I decided it was time to settle down. So when I saw this job, it seemed a reasonable compromise between personal commitments and my reluctance to stay in one place.
For me, it was something that just caught my eye, not just ordinary run-of-the-mill stuff. And if you get the time, you get a good view out of the windows.
And how do you stop things from spilling over when the train moves?
It's not a problem for me. I was a chef on a liner, so I've got plenty of experience of cookery in motion.
Yeah, but I think it helps if you only half-fill saucepans with boiling water. Even so, they often spill over and you start saying nasty things to yourself about the driver, and it's not usually his fault.
Yeah. Let's just say that you quickly learn not to put things under the grill without keeping an eye on them.
Has either of you had any major disasters?
Well, I'd only been in the job for 3 days and I had this huge roast in the oven. I opened the door, turned around for a moment, distracted, I suppose, and it just flew out. Fortunately, it landed in the sink, so it was okay.
And what qualities would you say it was necessary for a railway chef to have?
From my point of view, dedication and determination. You won't get anywhere without these.
And let's admit it, a sense of humour. There have been times when I would have resigned long ago if I hadn't had that.